Today on Better Book Clubs, tips for reading Beowulf. Probably the coolest thing about reading Beowulf is that you're reading a poem that's 1,000 years old. Beowulf was written by a poet whose name has been lost to history. It was written sometime between the 7th and 10th centuries, and it was written in Old English or Anglo-Saxon. So most of us will have to read it today in translation into modern English. And the copy that I chose to read was a fairly recent translation by the Irish poet Seamus Heaney. What I really love about this translation is that on the left-hand side, you can see the Old English transcription of the poem, and on the right side, the translation of it into modern English. And so as you're reading through, sometimes you can kind of glance through the Old English, get a feel for what the language looks like. And if you'd like an idea of what it sounds like, I'll put a link below to a really great reading/performance of the poem from the 92nd Street Y in New York City. In the introduction to this edition, Heaney calls the poem a work of the greatest imaginative vitality, a masterpiece where the structuring of the tale is as elaborate as the beautiful contrivances of its language. It's a really important text. It's taught in many, many English departments, particularly now at the graduate school level. And it's thrilling to read because you're reading this ancient text. So as you sit down to read Beowulf, just take a moment to sit with that. Also, if you're interested in what the text looks like in the original, just one copy of the manuscript survives, and that's housed at the British Library in London. So if you're lucky enough to be in London, you could go and see the original manuscript for yourself. So let me give you a few tips for reading this classic of English literature, because it's not an easy read for those of us who are coming to it with a more modern sensibility of what a story should do. Also, in the introduction to this edition, Heaney writes that readers coming to the poem for the first time are likely to be as delighted as they are discomfited by the strangeness of the names and the immediate lack of known reference points. And it can be discomforting to read Beowulf because most of us have very little conception of the history of this geographical region, Scandinavia, and of the names and of the time period. So we're really kind of swimming in completely unfamiliar waters. And that makes all of the allusions in the poem difficult to follow. One thing that Heaney does to help us out, and I'm sure this is true of other editions as well, is to put a family tree in the back, but I didn't discover that this was here until I got to the back of the book. That said, don't get yourself all tied up in knots trying to follow these family relationships. Just try to go with the story the first time through. It is helpful to know a couple of things. One of them is that Beowulf belongs to the group of peoples known as the Geats, and they are from the southern part of what is now Sweden, and he crosses the water to Denmark to help out the people who are actually in this version also called the Danes, and their leader is a king called Hrothgar. And if you even get those two names and two groups of people right, you'll be able to follow a lot of the story. Another thing that's helpful to understand about Beowulf is that the arc of the story is different from what you might expect. And I found this even going into the text on this rereading that I did recently, even though I had read it before. I read it a long time ago, back in graduate school. I was thinking of it as an adventure fantasy story. And I think that's often how it's posed in popular culture today. If it gets spoken of at all, it's spoken of in terms of the battle that Beowulf wages against the monster Grendel. The thing is, that's not really what the story of Beowulf is. It's really more a history, or you might call it historical fiction. We don't really know how historically true it is, and certainly it has some fantastical elements like a dragon guarding a treasure. But it is written more like a history. It's telling the story of a great man and a great king. And if you can think of the story that way, instead of expecting an adventure story in which there's going to be rising action and a climactic fight scene of some kind, then I think you're going to enjoy the poem more and understand what it's doing a little bit better. With that in mind, then, you might want to read through a different lens or with a different attitude towards the story. So instead of looking for plot and action and adventure, or even really looking for characterization in any of the other characters, you might want to read thinking about the values that are expressed by this poem. So just a couple of things, for example, what makes a good king? What makes a bad king? How does this society think about wealth and money, and particularly gold and treasure? So if you're asking those kinds of questions, instead of looking for the story to do something that it's not going to do, again, I think you're going to get more out of it and appreciate it for what it is. I often talk about something being beautifully written. Most of the classics are, and Beowulf is no exception. So of course it's going to depend on which translation you read, how the language is going to be translated. It's going to be, some of the translations differ from one another in terms of word choice, diction, quite a bit. But let me give you one example from Heaney's translation of a passage that is just beautifully rendered. In this passage, the king of the Danes, Hrothgar, is speaking to Beowulf about what the threat is to his kingdom and his people. And he's describing what Beowulf is going to be facing, what he's going to be up against. He says, "A few miles from here, a frost-stiffened wood waits and keeps watch above a mere. The overhanging bank is a maze of tree roots mirrored in its surface. At night there, something uncanny happens. The water burns, and the mere bottom has never been sounded by the sons of men. On its bank, the heather stepper halts. The hart in flight from pursuing hounds will turn to face them with firm set horns and die in the wood rather than dive beneath its surface. That is no good place." Heaney's translation of Beowulf is full of passages like that, really kind of unusual turns of phrase, beautiful poetic lines that will draw you into the story if you pay attention to them. Good luck with your reading of this ancient text, and I hope you enjoy it. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below. If you like what you see here, please remember to subscribe, and I'll be back soon with another episode of Better Book Clubs.